Greetings and welcome to a very special Issues Forum hosted by the Congressional Black Caucus Spouses. My name is Sonia Douglas Horsford, and I am pleased to serve as host and moderator for this very important discussion about education entitled, How Are the Children? Black Education in the Wake of COVID. I currently serve as Associate Professor of Education Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University, where I also serve as director of the Black Education Research Collective, a research center dedicated to improving educational opportunities and outcomes for Black children and youth through strategic partnerships between research, policy, and practice communities. Before we begin, on behalf of the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, we want to extend our appreciation to Microsoft and the National Education Association for sponsoring this very special Issues Forum. Microsoft enables digital transformation for the era of an intelligent cloud and an intelligent edge. Its mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. We want to extend special thanks to Fred Humphreys, Corporate Vice President of U.S. Government Affairs for Microsoft. The Congressional Black Caucus spouses are also especially grateful for Mr. Humphreys' commitment to our work over the years. We also thank the National Education Association, another longstanding partner with the CBC and Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. The NEA remains committed to eradicating institutional racism, white supremacy culture, and fighting for racial justice in education, issues that are also front and center as part of today's session. The disproportionate and devastating impact of COVID-19 on Black populations in the United States holds significant implications for the educational lives of Black children and youth. According to the Washington Post, majority Black counties have experienced 3 times the number of COVID cases as that of majority white counties, and a death rate nearly 6 times as high. In addition to further revealing racial health disparities in the form of COVID infections and loss of Black lives, Black livelihoods have also been affected, with the Black unemployment rate at Depression-era levels and opportunities to get jobs or government assistance loans limited or inaccessible. Overrepresented as essential workers and less likely to receive medical care for attention than their white counterparts, COVID's impact on Black America is felt far beyond the domain of public health. With approximately 7.7 Black students enrolled in the nearly 100,000 public schools in the US, the dangerous and cumulative impact of COVID on this school-age population amid an already declining economy holds dire consequences for school funding and support. Sadly, many of these students were receiving an inadequate and inequitable education prior to COVID, with school closures in response to the pandemic revealing what many in the education community already knew about the problem of racial inequality and injustice in the nation's schools. And despite calls among educators and policymakers to use this moment to reimagine education into something more equitable post-COVID, the policy change and action needed to move forward requires research that considers the histories, complexities, contradictions, and possibilities associated with the education of children and youth in Black and other historically disenfranchised communities. To help us better understand what's at stake and how we might envision better educational futures, we have an esteemed panel of educational leaders invited to address these important questions. And so I'd like to welcome our very first panelist. Well, I'll introduce our panelists first and then invite them to share their remarks on this topic. Our first panelist is Dr. Ghislaine Ganu, Vice President of Strategy and Programs for the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. With more than 15 years of experience working across the education sector, Dr. Ganu brings to the foundation a breadth of experience that includes work with nonprofits, individual schools, and school districts. Most recently, she served as the Chief Program Officer for Phi Delta Kappa International, a professional organization for educators. In this role, she designed and led programs that supported school district leaders, provided leadership coaching surrounding issues of equity and social justice, and created and facilitated an ongoing community that allows system-level leaders in districts from across the country to learn from one another. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ganu. Next, we'll have Dr. Kent McGuire, who is Program Director of Education at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Dr. McGuire leads the investments of the Hewlett Foundation's teaching and learning and open educational resources strategies, with a focus on helping all students succeed in college, work, and civic life. Dr. McGuire is a veteran of the National Education Movement for Public Education and was the president and CEO previously of the Southern Education Foundation. Prior to that, he served as the Dean of the College of Education at Temple University and was a tenured professor in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies. Dr. McGuire also served as an education program officer at the Pew Charitable Trust and served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education from 1998 to 2001. We will then be joined by Dr. Naila Nasir, who serves as the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation, an organization that supports research about education. Dr. Nasir was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 to 2019, and served as Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley beginning in November of 2015. She earned her PhD in Educational Psychology at UCLA in 2000 and was a member of the faculty in the School of Education at Stanford University from 2000 to 2008. Her work focuses on issues of race, culture, learning, and identity. She is the author of Racialized Identities, Race and Achievement Among African American Youth, published in 2011, and most recently, We Dare Say Love, Supporting Achievement in the Educational Life of Black Boys, published in 2018. She has also published numerous scholarly articles and is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, for which she also serves as the president-elect. And we extend our congratulations to her on that role. We're also pleased to have closing remarks delivered by the newly elected president of the National Education Association, Ms. Becky Pringle.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. Let me begin by extending my appreciation for the courageous leadership of Dr. Sonia Douglas Horsford, CBC Chair Representative Karen Bass, CBCF President and CEO Tanya Vesey, and all of our CBC spouses. I speak from a place of knowing that your support of our CBC members says everything about your dedication to our ambitious racial justice agenda and saving and making more perfect our democracy. Hey, Black child, be what you can be. Learn what you must learn. Do what you can do. And tomorrow, your nation will be what you want it to be. In this excerpt from Hey, Black Child by Chicago poet Usini Eugene Perkins, Brother Perkins is alluding to a future that has not yet arrived in America, making his poem as relevant today as it was 45 years ago. The images still evoke pain and longing. 15-year-old Elizabeth Eckford facing the National Guard in Little Rock in 1957. The U.S. Marshals in New Orleans escorting 6-year-old Ruby Bridges to school in 1960, amidst the spitting and screaming mobs blocking her entrance. They are a reminder of the bravery and courage of our young people who know they have nothing to lose but their chains. Marian Wright Edelman argues that these moments in history were born out of our nation's birth defect of slavery that fueled the racism and led to generations of economic inequality and persistent gaps in resources and opportunity for quality public education. Not surprisingly, the COVID-19 pandemic has only widened the existing racial disparities, and it has made our fight so much more urgent. State and local budget cuts are having an even more devastating impact, severely restricting our students' access to an education that sparks their curiosity and inspires their imagination. These inequities, the result of systemic racism and classism and inadequate funding for our public schools, were never hidden from view. But under the bright lights of COVID-19, we can no longer turn away from the fact that not all of our students have access to the educators, resources, and tools they need. We know that 1 in 3 Black children are living in poverty, a number that is steadily rising. We also know that 1 in 4 Black children don't know when their next meal will come. According to the Pew Research Center, the technology needed to access the internet is still out of reach for at least 16 million pre-K students. And in this moment, it's not just the coronavirus that's hurting our students. The ongoing displays of police brutality and killings in full view of our children tell them that this nation does not value their lives or their future. We have to be the ones who assure them that we see their humanity. We have to be the leaders who do what we must to create a public education system that allows every student to live into their brilliance. And our work begins by supporting our students and parents and educators who oppose the opening of school buildings before they are safe. But we can't stop there. We have to join with education and community partners to address the learning gaps for our students. Let me assure you that the 3 million members of the NEA are ready to lead a movement that reclaims public education as a common good, as the foundation of this democracy. And we are ready to transform it into a racial and socially just and equitable system that is designed to prepare every student, everyone, to succeed in a diverse and interdependent world. Every decision we make is grounded in that aspirational future, because NEA members understand that we can't just stand in the gaps for our children today. We must find the fortitude and creativity and will to disrupt the inequities at a systemic level. James Baldwin cautioned, "There is never a time in the future when we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now. The time is always now to seek fairness and respect and equality. The time is always now to organize and agitate, rise and resist. The time is always now to show up and show out. We must be brave and unapologetic, resilient and relentless. The members of the National Education Association stand ready to work with the CBC members and spouses to do what we must so tomorrow our nation will be what our young people want it to be. Then we can say, hey, Black children, be what you can be. CBC, our children, our babies are depending on us to be worthy of them.
Okay, and now it's time to get started with our panel. Dr. Ganu, I'd like to begin with you. Help us ground this conversation around the state of Black education in the COVID moment and the countless other challenges that are currently facing Black students, educators, families, and communities. What would you say are the major issues that we face, and how does your organization see, or what does your organization see as effective approaches and solutions to these issues?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Horsford. It's such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank you. Thank the Black Education Research Collective and the Congressional Black Caucus for making space for this very necessary conversation as children, young people, families, and communities and educators are all trying to figure out what education looks like in the midst of a global health pandemic. And when I first saw the title of this session, How Are the Children? I really appreciated that really deeply, because I'm not sure I know anyone with any degree of consciousness who is okay right now, including our children and our young people. And that question, how are the children, had me go back and check in with some young people whose voices need to be centered in the conversation that we're having. So I would like to start by bringing us a few direct quotes from some of their experiences. So student number one mentioned, I've been fortunate that I go to a school somewhere where they gave me a laptop and I have pretty good internet. I know many of my peers do not have that and had a hard time staying connected to school and teachers when things shut down. Second young person said, when the pandemic started, they gave me a schedule and I was so overwhelmed with assignments. It's like they forgot we are trying to learn in the middle of a pandemic and people are dying. I need more structure and guidance so I can connect with teachers more and get help. I also need schools and teachers to chill. We can't focus on all these things during a pandemic. And the third young person shared this. I'm honestly so tired. And I hope that because of everything happening now, people realize that school needs to be way different. Like, what's really important? Seriously, I don't think I need to learn all the things they have us doing. I need teachers who can teach us and have conversations about real life. Like, what's happening now? Are we even going to have a world to grow up in? If not, what's the point? And I need white kids to learn and feel all this stuff happening too, like we do. Otherwise, I don't know how I'm going to make it this year. These are three young people. So I would say the children are brilliant. The children are organizing and making their voices heard, especially when supported by adult allies. The children are paying attention to how we show up, to how we treat each other, to how we treat them. James Baldwin said, to be Negro and to be relatively conscious in this country is to be in a rage almost all of the time. So yes, the children are also in a rightful state of rage. And I, quite frankly, struggle with understanding why school systems, educators, parents, and communities are being asked to make impossible decisions about reopening school in person in any form. And you mentioned all of the stats that we all have had access to for many months now. Black people are among those most disproportionately impacted by this virus. And we also know that the parents and guardians of Black children are largely represented in the category of people considered essential workers. Now, we've had several reports in recent weeks that have shown that even with those statistics, Black people, Black families realize what has to be done because actual human lives are at stake. So in many of the reports that have been conducted in recent weeks, most Black households are shown to strongly support keeping all instruction online for the foreseeable future, as opposed to the majority of white parents. And in families that do not have the luxury of keeping our students home 100% of the time, we find our young people caught up in a cycle that perpetuates harm on many levels, mentally, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. So with regard to the state of Black education in the era of COVID, in our work at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, we've heard some common themes from young people, from educators and families over the last 5 months. Trauma is something that we have to really take seriously, individually and collectively. None of us can be all right in a time when we are not only experiencing the illness and death of loved ones, or of loved ones. So we have an opportunity to invest in trauma and mental health practices for all people, especially for Black youth and educators. And coupled with investments in trauma care and mental health supports, Dr. Dina Simmons offers up a helpful frame for us to think about what social emotional learning should look like in the era of COVID. She talks about social emotional learning in context and through an anti-racist and equity lens. And she also explains that failing to consider how to change our approach to social emotional learning will continue to perpetuate harm, because it will use social emotional learning as a means to get Black students to just be compliant, like we've always done, or to label them as defiant and deficient. Like if you listen to conversations about the COVID slide now that describe learning losses and the implications for what needs to be prioritized this year, it leaves us quite concerned. The second major challenge being faced by Black education right now is not new, not shocking: racism and anti-Blackness. We've known this. COVID only lays bare the challenges and puts it in our faces. So racism and anti-Blackness shows up in the curriculum, its lack of representation, its lack of cultural relevance, in the barriers that Black educators are mentioning facing in the profession. It's showing up and showing us that we are at a crossroad where we can choose to invest in policies and practices that reinforce the status quo, or we can leverage the moment and movement happening right now to invest in strategies that allow Black educators, Black children, and Black communities to thrive more. The digital divide is another challenge that we know about. The digital divide affects every state, every type of community, but it's more pronounced in rural communities and in Black, Latinx, and Native American households. So young people cannot adequately learn in a world where digital and remote learning is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future. Virtual learning and instruction is another challenge that's being named by families, by young people, and by educators. So really focusing on what's truly necessary. I read an article lately that talked about Marie Kondoing the curriculum to really think about what's important and necessary at a time when young people's bandwidth to absorb learning is quite frankly limited. And coupled with that, professional development approaches that need to change. We also know funding and policy. You mentioned it, Dr. Horsford. The work that needs to be done requires resources and intentional policy changes. There's just no sugarcoating that. Now, I feel super blessed and privileged to work in a foundation that has been on a journey towards racial equity in public education for at least a couple of years now. We've been in the business of investing in student-centered learning and have recently realized that that approach was not centering the needs of communities that were most impacted by the challenges that we seek to resolve. And right now at the foundation, our mission is realized in a number of ways by shifting our grant making to general operating support, supporting organizations led by people of color who are working on a number of important goals related to racial equity in public education in service to children, young people, parents, and educators. We also really believe in and invest deeply in amplifying youth voice and leadership, which right now looks like supporting incredible organizations made up of young people who are organizing for policy and practice change. And lastly, I will say these investments have resonated deeply in Black communities throughout New England, as well as in communities of color and indigenous communities that have been for far too long fighting and working towards transformational justice effort. If you ask me what promising practices look like, the brilliant Charlene Carruthers in her book, Unapologetic, really has this line that stuck with me: power concedes nothing without organized demand. So I want to shout out the work of organizations like the Students for Educational Justice in Connecticut, who work with other young organizers across the state of Connecticut and elected officials to lead campaigns that led to the successful passage of a bill last year mandating that all high schools offer a course in Black and Latino studies by July 2022. These were efforts led by young people. Also want to shout out the work of organizations like Portland Empowered that applied pressure to the Portland Public School District in Maine to change and sever their relationship with police and turn those resources towards actual services and supports related to mental health, trauma, and professional development for educators. Similarly, organized demand looks like leveraging opportunities of this moment where we are fighting the pandemic of COVID-19 and anti-Blackness in all facets of our lives and institutions, to reimagine, to tear down when necessary and rebuild, to dream, to make some radical changes. And this work right now is being done through organizations like the Abolitionist Teaching Network, which is really invested in developing and supporting educators to fight injustices within their schools and communities. So in the era of COVID, I will say Black children are not well. Black children are not well, and we have to fight like we've never fought before. And we have to consider approaches outside of the norm of what we've invested in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gnu, for helping to not only shed light on some of the issues, but also amplify the voices and organizations that are really doing work that show great promise. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Dr. McGuire, your thoughts. How are the children and what does Black education look like in the current moment from where you sit?
I really appreciate the opportunity to, to speak. Ghislaine covered a lot of ground, and so I will try to think of how to build on what she said about that, as opposed to a repeat of it. I do think that the condition was not great pre-COVID. Maybe to add to Ghislaine's remark from a kind of a descriptive point of view, what we know is that Black kids were more subject to exclusionary, disciplinary policies, generally speaking. Substantially less likely to be assigned an experienced teacher. And more likely to be attending an under-resourced school. These are broad descriptive statistics, but that pattern is alive and well. Almost any place in the country you want to look. And so no surprise that learning outcomes, as a consequence, continue to lag behind our white counterparts. There are lots of other reasons for that, but at a high policy level, those three really stand out. And so things are even worse now. If nearly a third of all students across the country struggle with access either to devices or to access to the internet, those percentages go up for kids who are poor and kids who are Black and brown. As has been stated, in families that are disproportionately impacted by COVID, the loss of life, the sudden unemployment, food insecurity, et cetera, the social and emotional toll on kids is a really big deal. We put some money into some surveys in the spring, for instance, to try to see if we could document what the student experience was when schools shut down mid-March through the middle of June. And what we learned gives us pause from a learning loss standpoint. In spite of nearly Herculean efforts from teachers, the disruptions from some of these aforementioned forces really made it tough for kids to stay engaged academically. It just is what it is. So that's what I think we're left with. In terms of our work, we have 4 areas of focus. One, and probably the largest, are what we're calling a series of deep dives, where we're working with a small number of districts and their communities geographically spread around the country. Let's see if I can name some of them. Baltimore, Cleveland, Jackson, Mississippi are among them. And the idea here is to help them address the underlying systemic questions or issues related to race and oppression and how that affects learning outcomes. COVID has caused us to adjust our thinking about what's most needed in this moment in these communities. And so we're trying to bring resources to bear to increase the likelihood that the kinds of issues Ghislaine laid out are ones that the districts can give more attention to as they think about how to reopen, and especially as they adjust to the uncertainties that are going to be, is the only thing that is certain about the fall and probably the balance of this academic school year. A second focus for us has to do with the capacity of educators, who as a group, of course, were summarily unprepared for what hit them in the spring. And no matter how hard we focus on getting teachers ready for what's happening this fall, they'll be doing something the system wasn't fundamentally designed to do, to sort of figure out the balance between remote and in-person instruction and the like. There are several other things we care about with this work on educator capacity, having first to do with helping educators leverage the science on how kids learn in the first place. And secondly, attend to these issues of cultural competence and awareness, given the new diverse majority that attend our schools. I'm close on time, so let me mention a couple of other things. We too have a body of work on student and community voice. In this moment, we think it's hugely important that there be a lot of transparency about the plans that are out there, and that students have an opportunity to weigh in, first on what they need, and secondly, on their experience. And finally, we're developing a body of work around curriculum resources and support, giving, again, specific attention to cultural relevance and race, and to civic reasoning and literacy. If we had more time, I'd go into why I think that's so hugely important. Maybe I can get Naila to touch on that instead. 2 or 3 things very quickly in terms of not so much practices as things I think policymakers need to give some real thought and attention to. First, in the wake of COVID, I just think we have to do what we can to learn from this moment. Think of us as being in front of a set of natural experiments that are unfolding right before our eyes. We need to figure out what did and didn't work from that with an eye toward the future. Secondly, we really need to leverage what we know and understand about the correlates between student well-being and student learning. I think if we don't connect those dots, 2021 is really going to be tough. And finally, I think we need to have a conversation about testing and assessment in this country. I'm actually pretty worried about it. Remember, fond as we have been, especially in the civil rights community, of standardized assessment, they measure a small fraction of what we really care about. 2, they explain in large measure the so-called achievement gap about which we're so concerned. But 3, they generate so little information about what teachers and administrators actually need to do to improve learning outcomes, especially for Black kids. What we really need is attention to generating the information that provides good feedback for the kids and for the adults. And I'm worried that this attention to learning loss is going to migrate us back to ineffective ways of measuring progress. I'm a good 2 minutes over my time, and so I'm going to pause here and hand the floor back, Sonia, to you.
Thank you, Kent, for those very important insights, especially around educator capacity and the impacts of learning loss and whether or not we're really going to learn anything from this moment. So thank you for helping us to draw attention to those issues. Next, we have Dr. Naila Nasir from the Spencer Foundation. What are your thoughts? What have you seen as it relates, or how would you answer the question, how are the children? And what are some of the things that you have experienced from where you sit as it relates to Black education in this moment?
Yeah, thank you. Happy to be here. Well, my colleagues have really laid out the territory nicely. I'm crossing off from my notes the things I was going to say that they already said. So I'm going to maybe jump in. It's obviously, we are in the midst of a national crisis, right? Both a public health crisis that's impacting Black communities disproportionately, as well as a racial crisis in this country. Both are extreme, both are dire. And they're having extreme effects, right? We've seen schools, both higher ed and K-12, transition to remote learning, pretty unprepared in the spring, a little more prepared this fall. We've seen heightened trauma and uncertainty. But I think I'm gonna focus my comments on some silver linings in this space, because like any crisis opens up possibility for the future to imagine and think about things differently. And I think there are a few strands along which possibility has opened in this moment that we could productively step into. I would say that first, we have seen more change in education systems in the past than arguably in the past 50 years. We've learned that we can change massively. And that for me is a bit of a bright spot. We've made pretty drastic moves in many places, California being a great example of closing the digital divide, really moving towards what it means for school districts to partner with internet companies to provide access for families. And so it's not perfect, it's not done, but we're moving in a direction with lots of major investment there. We're seeing schools realizing that families matter, that families are partners in their child's education, not just in getting them off to school, but actually participating in the teaching and learning process. And I think that is something really important, especially for Black communities where families tend to be viewed as the problem or the barrier, as the reason why kids aren't doing, that there's an opportunity to recraft that into what are the amazing things that are happening in families for kids right now. We've seen as pausing of many of these large-scale assessments that have racialized outcomes and and we know that they don't measure what we most want to know. So pausing those assessments, SATs, GREs, standardized state exams for K-12, opens up a conversation around what do we really need to know. Black young people are getting a reprieve from the racial microaggressions of their daily school life to some degree. I have a 15-year-old son who was not sad to leave behind some of the challenges of being a Black male student in a large comprehensive high school. And so there's something about being in family and in community that allows us to wrap our children in love a different kind of way. We have seen more public and media attention to education than I remember in my entire lifetime. On the news, in the New York Times, people are talking about issues of education. And I think that's, if we can keep that going and really lean into it, that's a potential silver lining. And I think alongside that, a deep realization of how extensive and damaging the current inequalities are. In society broadly, we're seeing, mass protests, people, taking to the streets en masse across generation, across racial lines to say, this isn't okay. And I think in education, similarly, folks talking about racial inequality in education with a fresh lens and a fresh eye. And I think all of this opens up a space. People are talking, as you mentioned, Professor Horsford at the beginning, about reimagining. And I don't know that I remember a time when such widespread calls for reimagining have happened around education. And I think that reimagining is about centering what's most important. I think both of you talked a bit about social and emotional learning. What's most important for our children is wellness and rigor. right? Both of those things. I, as a Black parent, know that I consistently have to choose. Do I choose rigor? Or do I choose a place that's going to culturally love my children? And it's rare that I can find an environment that provides both. I think there's a space open to talk about that. And I think there's a space open to talk about how we use technology in more sophisticated ways in the service of deep learning, not just in the service of superficial transfer of content. And so I think there's a new opportunity for that. And to your point, Kent, about civic education and civic engagement, I will take that baton and say that in this national racial crisis, we are seeing the product of a lack of civic education and a lack of civic engagement and a deep realization across our nation that we have to do better, that we have to prepare our young people to be critical readers, to be dedicated voters, to really understand the political system and their role in it. And this new activism we're seeing is in service to that. Since I am a researcher and I run a research foundation, when I think about what we need to do, I would argue that we need to understand all of these processes much more deeply and with much more levels of nuance. So at Spencer, into that, we've been thinking a lot about our strategy around racial and social inequality. I'll also say, silver lining wise, and with my foundation hat on, that foundations are taking up issues of racial inequality in new and expansive ways. And it's been, I don't know, Ken, if you, or just, it's been fascinating to watch that new collectives in the foundation world happened around COVID and then extended around racial inequality. So I think there's a collective nature to the work right now that is promising. I'll just say at Spencer, we've been funding amazing things by amazing scholars, including Professor Horsford just won one of our incredibly competitive COVID inequality grants to study Black education in the wake of COVID. We funded another young scholar, Thandika Chapman, to look at homeschooling for Black essential worker moms and what's happening in those families. We funded an amazing study on linguistic racialization and that connection to disciplinary action for Black children. So all of that to say, we're thinking about our portfolio funding that moves our knowledge along, and also thinking more broadly about how we push on funding research that comes from a place of strength and asset, not from a place of deficit and what communities don't do. And so we've been leaning hard into that, and that's been really, really productive and exciting. And in terms of what we need to do, I think we need to do more of all of this. We need to reimagine education and build more equitable systems. We need to question educational practices that disrespect parents and families. We need to recenter sustaining and cultivating humanity and attending to the full Black children as a core anti-racist practice. We need curriculum and pedagogy that loves Black people, that teaches from that place of love and respect. I mean, one of the most profound findings in the research world of the last decade is the effect of ethnic studies courses on achievement. Amazing, amazing results. And we need to cultivate a pipeline of Black teachers in new kinds of ways. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Nasir, for outlining our educational policy agenda for the next few years. It's really important to look at the silver linings and the opportunities that these crises and these moments kind of provide for us, as you mentioned. So thank you for reminding us of the possibilities. We have some time for a few questions, so I just wanted to pose a couple of questions in closing. One, this one is for Dr. Ganu. What obligation would you say in this moment that the philanthropic community and funders do have to the issues that we're talking about today? Dr. Nasir had mentioned how the foundation world in particular is really kind of responding to identifying ways in which they can help address some of these issues. What are you seeing, and what do you think that the obligation of that community is to this work?
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Horsford. I feel like Dr. Nasir and Dr. McGuire have touched on some of it. I consider myself a baby philanthropist. I've only been in it for a little bit over a year and a half. And I really value the work of Edgar Villanueva, particularly his latest work on decolonizing wealth, and others who long before me have called on philanthropy to function and operate differently, especially to question our relationship to the money that we control and to do our part to right the injustices of our past and present. So I think philanthropic organizations should, one, revisit their history, right? Like I was born and raised in Africa, and we talk about the concept of Sankofa a lot, which is about looking back at the past and learning from the past. So I think philanthropic organizations should really spend time revisiting their past and examine the origin of their money, including considering ways in which communities of color and Black communities in particular have been harmed in the process of accumulating wealth. And once that's done, really taking steps to return the money to communities it belongs to. I've been saying that since I started at the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. When I hear conversations about risk, when I hear conversations about restrictions, I'm like, it's not our money. This money belongs to communities. So how do we get better at returning that money? And in this case, it means funding Black-led social change, funding Black educators and non-Black allies who are working to fight anti-Blackness and racism in public education every day, through the examples that were listed here during this conversation. It means getting comfortable with funding things that schools and Black people, Black communities say they want for themselves without all of the usual strings attached. And there's a movement of foundations doing that more and more, right? And leaning more and more into general operating support and flexible grant making. It means thinking outside of the frames we've internalized and turning to organizations like yours, Dr. Horsford, the Black Education Research Collective, to lead work at a nexus of policy, research, and practice. Like we know how to do it. And our lived experiences matter to the approaches and the methodologies that are leveraged to make good work happen. It means looking to organizations like the Center for Black Educator Development to lead the way on how we think about diversifying the teacher pipeline and recruiting and retaining Black educators into the profession. It means funding the expansion, the umbrella of what we have for far too long accepted to be the meaning and purpose of education. Dr. Nasir laid it out so beautifully. How do we include political education for consciousness and transformational justice, and other like Black and African-centered ways of being, knowing, and doing into what education looks like as we reimagine? And how do we fund people who are doing that? So I see that as the calling for foundations. It means supporting community school partnerships, state and national coalitions, and policy and advocacy work that help to sustain conditions for change to be permanent. And it means investing in this work for the long haul, right? In my short life in philanthropy, I've experienced us funding Black-led social change, but only wanting to fund it for a period of time. These issues were here long before COVID, and if we don't change how we function and invest in organizations for the long haul, these issues will be here long after COVID.
Thank you. It is an exciting time, and I guess I wonder, as the philanthropic community is, again, stepping up to address some of these issues, whether it's systemic racism or the crisis of COVID. Dr. McGuire, Dr. Nasir, what do you see as the role of researchers and policymakers who are also committed to this work? How do we build those partnerships and collaboration? And what should those communities be doing to help connect with the work and the initiatives that you're advancing right now?
Go ahead, Naima.
Well, I'll take up the researcher part of that, and I'm gonna leave you the policymaker part of it. So I do think knitting those connections is really, really important. As I said, I think we need to study these major social changes that are happening and their effect on education. We are in this place of widespread racial activism, and what effect does that have on young Black people, on their identities, on their sense of self, on their wholeness, on their civic engagement, on for the future? We have a kind of mass natural experiment happening, and I think we need to lean into it and really understand the effects. Because what we know is that racial consciousness supports educational achievement. So is there something happening at the collective level that is gonna kind of propel this generation forward in new kinds of ways? I think we also need to understand this new role that families are taking up in their children's education, and what kinds of racial socialization is happening within families in this moment. I feel like we, in some ways, attend to the ways that Black young people are navigating race in their school lives and in their lives more generally, and understanding how to support them in doing that more productively as we're on this long road to try to dismantle racial inequality and oppression. Knowing how to support young folks and what natural processes work well is really important. And I think just being tuned into what adaptations have we made in this space that we need to keep is going to be super crucial moving forward. And I think that scholarship needs to attend to these issues that are in the public mind and in the policymaker mind, and be part and parcel of coming to some important solutions alongside policymakers and practitioners.
Thank you. Kent, what about the policymakers?
The first thing I want to say is that I've just struggled with the last decade or so with this assumption or this premise that our pie is fixed, and our inclination to succumb to the idea that we can't afford this or we can't afford that as the wealthiest country, on the planet. There is much we can do if we could shake this assumption. And what we have is a political and public will problem, not a capacity problem. So that's the first thing I'd encourage the Congressional Black Caucus to really grapple with, especially as we think about changing administrations and the really significant pressure and demands that the public sector in general and public education and higher education in particular are likely to face. Second thing I want to say is facts and evidence matters. And we shouldn't be afraid to look for it. We need to be clear about the difference between fact and fiction. And we can turn to the research community for help with that. I want to say that's the second thing I want to say. To the extent that resources are scarce, this is a marvelous time to learn. I used the term natural experiments. Naila, I think, described it more fully. But what better time to understand the dynamics and correlations and patterns that are underway in this moment, so that as resources come back into view, we actually know how to deploy those resources on behalf of children and youth. Last thing I'll say, from a philanthropic point of view, yes, I too am encouraged. We'll see if this recent awakening around issues of race, how long that sticks. But I do think there are underlying forces in our business that need attention. We're very good at hiring bright people to draw everything up in advance and then go tell the field what they need to do. We're not nearly as good at putting an ear to the ground and hearing from our intended beneficiaries about what they need and want. Striking a better balance between strategy and need and motivation, I think, is something we're going to have to improve, especially if we're serious about moving more resources into underrepresented and neglected communities.
All right, well, there you have it. I just want to say thank you to our really incredible panel, Dr. Ghislaine Ganu, Dr. Kent McGuire, and Dr. Naila Nasir for sharing your insights, and really, in many ways, an agenda for us to think about. And I hope that we can continue these conversations across the research, practice, and policy communities to really move the needle and improve the experiences that Black children and youth or improve their educational experiences. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us, and for the work that you do to advocate for and on behalf of education.
Thank you.
At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. I want to commend the Congressional Black Caucus and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation for tireless work to promote opportunities for African Americans in the United States and to fight social injustice.